Good morning. Hello, Adele. Okay, we're at 11:01, so I think we'll begin. Let me just, sorry, I just want to do my recording. Okay, great. Thank you for joining me this morning, ladies. We are doing this week's Parsha, which is Parshas Vayera. So we're really moving along in our Chumash and in Sefer Bereshis, the book of Bereshis. And this week's Parsha begins with a revelation, with a divine revelation, where Hashem appears to Abraham. In fact, the name of the Parsha, Vayera, means, and he appeared, or and God appeared to him, because it says Vayera elav Hashem. So it means that God appeared to Abraham. Abraham was camped in the plains of Mamre, and he had just circumcised himself. So at the end of last week's Parsha, Avram circumcised himself at the age of 99 years old, and Hashem actually added the Hey to his name, and he now became Avraham. So very interestingly, there are 248 limbs and organs in one's body. Hello, Beulah, welcome back. Okay, and there are actually also 248 positive commandments. So we see that there's always a connection between our physicality and the observance of mitzvahs. Now, the word Avraham, or the word Avram, the name Avram, is made up of 243. So the gematria, the numerical value of Avram, is 243. When Hashem added the Hey to his name, because now Avram had brised himself, then his name, the gematria of his name, now becomes 248, which coincides with the number of positive mitzvahs. And Hashem said to Abraham, now you've done your bris milah, and now your name has the Hey added to it, so now you're complete. And it was after this act that Abraham now can have a child. So it's after this that we will see that Yitzchak is born. Now let's move on. So now we see where we are in context. Now let's move on to this week's Parsha. And in this week's Parsha, Vayera, we see that Hashem visits Abraham. This is an incredible moment of divine revelation. It's the first time that Hashem has appeared to Abraham. And many of the commentaries say that the reason that Abraham received this visit was because Hashem was doing what's called Bikur Cholim, which means visiting the sick. And in fact, the third day after an operation is usually when one feels the pain most intensely. And this was the third day since his Brit Milah. So we are told that the day was incredibly hot. In fact, Hashem orchestrated it that it would be one of the hottest days that ever was. It says Hashem took the sun out of its sheath so that there would be no filter from the heat of the sun into the earth. Why was this? Because Hashem knows that Abraham is completely the midah. He has completely the characteristic of chesed, of kindness. And so Abraham's greatest joy was to show chesed, was to show kindness to other people. And what he specifically excelled in was the mitzvah of Achnasas Orchim, which means welcoming guests, or in trying to invite guests. Oh, sorry, some people in the waiting room and I didn't see. Okay. So I'm just going to admit them. Oh, wait, 2 seconds. Okay. Welcome, ladies. Sorry, I didn't see that you were in the waiting room. So, Bill, thank you for the message. I just saw it. I just saw that there were people waiting to come in. So, despite the heat of the day, which is orchestrated by Hashem, And that's because Hashem knows that Abraham has just endured this intense procedure of his own bris milah at 99 years old. And therefore, he wants to spare him the need to look after guests that might pass by his tent. And so he made it so hot that people should not venture out on this day. Nevertheless, Abraham is sitting by the entrance of his tent and he's waiting, desperate to fulfill this mitzvah of kindness. So Hashem has appeared to him, and this is a moment of great mystical revelation and the privilege of the divine Shekhinah coming to visit Abraham or appearing to Abraham. And nevertheless, Abraham sees in the distance 3 strangers. There are 3 people who are coming past, who are coming by. So what does he do? He does the strangest thing. He says to Hashem, he says to the Creator, the entire power, the Almighty, he says, please will you wait? Because I just want to run and see if I can show hospitality to these guests. So that's a very, very interesting thing that he's done. And in fact, we learn out from there that more precious in terms of, even in the eyes of God, than welcoming the divine presence is actually to look after guests and to welcome guests into your home and to do everything when you have your guests to make them feel comfortable, to feed them, to give them to drink, to make them feel welcome and at home. And this is what Abraham did. And so he sees that there are these 3 strangers. In fact, they looked like Arab people. They looked like Arabs who were passing by. And suddenly he sees that they look at him and then they start to go in the opposite direction. They go away from Abraham. And he's very concerned that he's going to lose this opportunity to look after them. And therefore it says in the Chumash that he ran towards them in order to ask them to come, that he should be able to give them water and drink, and that they should wash their feet and get some shade in his tent, etc. So it's very interesting. What's brought out is why does the Chumash, which is very, very specific in all of the words and the terminology that is used, why does the Chumash say he ran towards them? When you run, you normally run after someone. You don't run towards someone. And what's brought out, a very beautiful insight that's brought out from this, is that in fact, Abraham was running towards them because they were on their way to come to his tent. And then they noticed that he's sick. He's just obviously undergone some kind of difficult physical procedure, and he's convalescing, he's recuperating. And so they didn't want to trouble him, and they started then to go away. But the way that they did it was very unique. They didn't turn around and walk away from him. They understood that this is a man of enormous spiritual stature, that this is a man of the greatest righteousness. And in fact, he was the expression of righteousness in the world at this time. It says of the Avos, it says of the forefathers, of our forefathers, that they are called chariots. Why are they called chariots? Or why are they called the chariot? Because they completely overcame their will and sublimated their will to the will of God, so that they would simply go in whichever direction Hashem directed them. So they didn't turn and walk away from him, but out of reverence, as a show of respect, they walked facing him and they walked backwards. In the same way that you often see people do when they're leaving the shul, or when they've just stood in front of the Aron Kodesh and they want to go back to their seat. Usually they'll take 3 or 4 steps backwards before turning around and going back to their seat. That is a show of reverence. And that's what they did for Abraham. And that's why it says in the Chumash, it's brought out that he ran towards them. Now, there's something very beautiful that we learn out from there, and that is that if we're ever standing in front of somebody who is worthy of respect or who has a position of authority, we should show enormous respect to them. And this is particularly true of our parents. So the mitzvah of Kibbud Avraham, of respecting parents, the Torah recognizes can be an incredibly challenging mitzvah. It can be incredibly hard to do this, right? Let's be real. How many times can your parents drive you nuts, okay? Or they do things that just get under your skin, or, you know, you think this is the way they have chosen to live their life and I'm choosing to live my life quite differently. And therefore, it's a very, very huge mitzvah to show respect to one's parents. In fact, the reason that I'm bringing this out, connected with what we're just learning here, with regards to the malachim, to these angels, because those three guests were in fact angels in disguise. And Abraham is because the Rebbe's mother, Rebbetzin Chana, shared a secret that when her son would come and visit her, when the Rebbe would go and visit his mother, when he said goodbye and he would take leave of her, he would always walk through the apartment and pretend to fix something on the coffee table and set a chair right and make sure that the paintings were straight. And while he was doing that, he would walk backwards as though he's looking at the apartment, making sure he can fix everything up. But in fact, Rebbetzin Chana said, I knew that was just a pretense in order that he should not turn his back on me and walk out giving his back to me. That was his way of showing incredible honor to his mother. And Hashem himself says that when you show honor to your parents, I myself take it as though you gave honor to me. So it's a mitzvah that is held in very high regard. And one of the reasons is that it can be incredibly challenging to live up to this. I'll tell you personally, I'm constantly thinking, I need to improve. I need to be more patient, right? And it's a journey. And it's one that we can, if we understand the importance of it though, then it strengthens us to recommit to that in a positive way. So to progress, as I said, it comes out that the three visitors, these three Arabs that are coming by the tent of Abraham and whom he convinced to come and enjoy his hospitality, they are in fact Malachim. And Abraham perceived their greatness. He actually perceived how important these three people were, that they were not as simple as they appeared. How is this brought out? He said to himself, if I see that the divine presence, Hashem's Shekhinah, does not depart when these three come by, then I'll understand that they are people of stature. And he also said to himself, I want to see how they treat one another. Because obviously people who are like spiritually refined are going to be very appropriate to one another. They're going to be considerate of one another. And he actually saw that. So we learn that they were the Malachim, they were the angels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. And their status actually goes in that order of hierarchy. First it's Michael, and then below him is the Malach Gabriel, and then below him in status is the Malach Raphael. And he saw how they had more reverence for Michael and showed reverence based on the different stages of hierarchy. And so he understood that these are actually very important people or holy beings. Now the three Malachim came on a mission. They didn't just come by so that Abraham could feel good about doing this mitzvah of welcoming guests, but they came in order to do a certain mission. The mission of Michael was to tell Abraham now that he's had his bris milah, and his name is Avraham and no longer Avram, and his name has the gematria now, has the numerical value of 248, which equals all the positive mitzvot and the limbs and organs of the body. Now he's complete. He comes to tell him the message that he's going to have a child, that 1 year from now, Sarah, his wife, will bear a son. That's the mission of Michael. The mission of Gabriel was to come and destroy Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah, or Sodom and Amorah. And those two cities, there are actually, I think, 3 cities that were destroyed. And that falls in this week's parasha, and we will discuss it a little bit. And then the third malach, Raphael, my understanding is that we know that he actually came in order to save Lot, to save the nephew of Abraham, who was living in Sodom, and he had been unfortunately influenced by the incredible depravity and negativity of this place. But nevertheless, he has to be saved, and we'll have a look at that. And so that is the job of Raphael. My understanding is that Raphael was also coming in order to help bring healing to Abraham. Because if you think about it, that is the job of the malach, of the angel Raphael. Remember when somebody is sick, God forbid, what do we say? We wish them a refuah shalema. You should have complete healing. And so we see how that's connected with this angel, the angel Raphael. And so Abraham takes care of his guests, and he actually escorts them when they continue on their journey. It says that when they had been given this hospitality by Abraham and been shown this great kindness, they turn and they face the cities of Sodom and Amorah, and they look at it disparagingly. They understand the cruelty that is taking place there, and they understand that this place has reached such a level of immorality that God has chosen to destroy it. So what was going on in this place of Sodom that is so terrible that it actually gets destroyed by God? The Midrash brings out how the people absolutely refused to do charity. Not only that, okay, a person decides to be a miser, or a person decides that he doesn't want to part with his hard-earned wealth, but it became illegal, so to speak, in this area for anybody to do an act of kindness or charity, to the extent that there were enormous punitive steps taken against the people if they did, which is terrible. And what's brought out in the Midrash is one example. There was a young woman, and she saw that there was a starving man in Sodom, and she knows that she's not really allowed to assist him. And people were certainly not allowed to host guests or to welcome strangers into this area. So she decides that she can't bear to see his suffering. And she took an urn and she hid some bread in it. And in this way, she hoped to assist him in a way that would be undetected. But when it was found out what she did, what did they do to her? In order to make an example of her, that other people should not try and do this sin of kindness and of charity, they smeared her with honey, and then they hung her on one of the communal walls in the city so that the bees would be drawn to her and she would be stung to death. There are many opinions that say that this young woman was one of the daughters of Lot. He had several daughters, and her cries of anguish were like the final straw when those cries reached heaven, and it was decided then up in the heavenly realms that this place would be destroyed. There was murder, there was immorality, there was incredible cruelty. And Lot was sitting by the city gates, and he sees that there are 3 strangers, or no, it's 2 strangers. Raphael had now departed because, not Raphael, Michael, the angel Michael had departed because his mission has now been fulfilled. But so he sees there two strangers by the city gates and he wants to welcome them in, because despite the fact that he's been living in Sodom for 25 years. This was a very fertile area. There was beautiful grasslands. It was an incredibly rich place in terms of the natural resources of it, and that was one of the reasons why Lot chose to live there. Lot sees these strangers, and despite the fact that he knows he can get into incredible trouble for doing so, the influence of his uncle Abraham on him has had such an impact that he wants to welcome them into his home. So we see that when we do that which is righteous, then we will always be influencing people. And a lot of times we're not even realizing the extent to which we are. It's interesting, I went to a conference in New York, the one year, the Kinus HaShlichos, and the conference for the Chabad emissaries. And we all were asked to tell our own stories. I was a guest. I'm not one of the official shlichos. And one of the women stood up, a young woman from, I don't know where she was from, but certainly not American or South African. And she said she was walking somewhere. She was driving somewhere on Saturday on Shabbat, and she just saw this frum man, and he's walking past her on Shabbat, and she took a look at him, and she decided, I have to keep Shabbat. That's it. I saw this person. It's had such an impact on me. That's it. From now on, we're keeping Shabbat. And she did. And she had grown more and more with time, progressively in her way. And till she got to this point where she had come to this conference and she was sharing the story. So Lot invites the angels to come to his home, he convinces them, and when the people in Sodom find out about this, they're furious. They're absolutely livid about it. And they start to come to his door and they start to demand that the guests be given to them so that they can deal with them in the way that is normally dealt with. And what's brought out in the commentaries is they were demanding that they take these guests in order to sodomize them. And that was very much one of the ways that they would meter out punishment. So you see the cruelty and depravity of this place. Let's just talk about Lot a little bit before we go and bring out some insights into this man. Was he a good man or was he a negative man? Well, he said to the people who were banging down his door, listen, I have two daughters. He had 4 daughters. 2 were married to Sodomites and 2 are unmarried. And he says to them, I have 2 daughters that have never been touched by a man. Take them and leave my guests because I've invited them in and I must look after them. So it shows you that he's certainly been influenced in the most terrible, shocking way by the people within this vicinity that he's living for so long. And his wife was also from Sodom. And he's not a good guy. He's no great guy. But nevertheless, he had to be saved. And that's very interesting. And there's a beautiful pasuk, there's a beautiful verse that's found in the Torah. I'm not sure the source, but it says, Hashem says, I found my servant David in Sodom. What does that mean? It's a beautiful insight. Hashem says that we understand the reason that Lot had to be saved was in fact because he is the ancestor of the holiest of holy. He is going to be the ancestor of Ruth, who is the great-grandmother of David HaMelech, from whom will be descended Mashiach. So we see here that in this darkness lay the seed for the greatest light. And we've brought this out before, but I'm going to repeat it again. that what happened was that when Sodom was completely destroyed, Lot and his wife was killed. Also, she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters that were unmarried hid in a cave, and their perception was the world's been destroyed. And so his 2 daughters lay with him because they thought we have to repopulate the world. And the one named her child, the son that was born from this union of such darkness. I mean, this union of a father and daughter together, which is absolutely forbidden in the Torah. One of the daughters who had a child from her father named her son Moab, which means from my father. And it's from this nation that Ruth actually was born. And then she becomes a righteous convert, one of the most righteous women in our history. And she becomes the great-grandmother of David HaMelech. So from him, from Lot, and from this shocking union, this terrible union, ultimately comes the greatest light, which is Mashiach. And so we see that when there is light, this shows us the spiritual principle. When there is light, when there is incredible holiness, the forces of darkness will do everything to prevent it from actually being expressed in the world. So when you have a shell that is really, really strong, and there's darkness, the darker it is, the greater the light that we can access in that darkness. And that should give us an enormous feeling of hope when we are in times of struggle. Because Hashem's given us that struggle in order that we struggle with it or wrestle with it so that we can crack through the darkness and extract the light. And it's only you or me who can extract the light from the particular challenge that you are given. Now, I just want to fast forward a little bit and bring something out about Avraham Avinu, and then we'll look at it from a much more Hasidic, mystical perspective and try and bring it all together. So later on in the Parsha, Avraham is called on to sacrifice his son Yitzchak. And we all know the story. But it's brought out in the Kabbalah that every time Avraham did a mitzvah, what it really was that he was experiencing was that he did a ritual of connection. Every mitzvah is a connector between ourselves and the divine. Remember how we've said that Hashem desires closeness with us. Hashem desires a connection with us, a deep connection, and the mitzvot are the way that he's given us in order to do this. So Avraham, every time he did a mitzvah, he felt this deep connection, and not only that, but he felt like he was embracing the divine. And it brought out from within him this great feeling of love. And so he felt a love for Hashem, and he fulfilled all the mitzvot with love. Now, when it came to doing the Akedah, the sacrifice of Yitzchak, Avraham felt nothing. He didn't feel that sense of love that he normally felt when he would do something in the way of a mitzvah for Hashem. And it's brought out, the mystical texts bring out, because this wasn't a mitzvah. Though God had told him to do it, Hashem's intention was to change it at the last minute, that he shouldn't follow through with that which he had been told to do by Hashem. And therefore, it wasn't a mitzvah. And therefore, he could somehow sense on a deep level, there was no feeling of love that came out or poured out from him when he was doing this commandment. Nevertheless, he did it, and he was prepared to fulfill it to the final step of sacrificing his child. But in the Chumash, we see the words of God following this test of Abraham are as follows. Hashem said, Now I see that you fear the Lord your God. In other words, you are not going to get any personal benefit from this, not even a sense of love for God, which sometimes, if that's our motivation, then that's what we're going to anticipate when we're doing a mitzvah. Now, Abraham was simply fulfilling the will of God, whether it gave him a feeling of fulfillment and connection or not. And that's why Hashem said, not only do you love me, but I see that indeed you fear the Lord your God as well. But we see from this that every time we do a mitzvah, we have this opportunity for incredible connection. I think we're living in a time where there is, Baruch Hashem, so much physical abundance. And there is so much that can distract us in terms of the pursuits of comfort, the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of physicality. And that's not a bad thing, because actually we are commanded to engage with the physicality, but to do it with a godly intention, in a godly way, according to the mitzvot, because then what we're doing is we're elevating that physicality, or we're bringing out the latent holiness in that physicality. And that's how we reveal God in this world. So, but nevertheless, to actually cultivate that feeling of love for God, that's something, and to have that awareness. You know, sometimes it's hard. We can completely forget about God for the entire day. When you live a day with an awareness of God and a feeling of connection, those are the happiest days. Those are the days where you kind of feel everything's like touched with a miracle. And there's usually a flow, such a beautiful flow in those days. So if we focus on doing mitzvot, then we can bring that out more and more often in our days. And of course, the Torah tells us the foundation of that is to start the day with tefillah, with prayer. So let's just look a little bit at the mechanics of a mitzvah in terms of, and the mechanics of righteousness and making positive choices in the world from the perspective of Chassidus. And I saw that this was brought out by the Alter Rebbe connected with this parsha. And he teaches as follows, that Chassidus teaches us that in order that God could create a finite world, he could not just allow his divine light to come down unfiltered into the world, because we'd just simply be overwhelmed by that. It would just be pure godliness in the world. And therefore, Hashem created a system of filters, so to speak. Okay, those who know the terminology in Hasidus, it's called Seder Hishtalshelus, which means like an order of going down, or an order of filtering. And Hashem also chose to express himself or manifest himself in this world through the 10 Sfirot, which means like the 10 soul powers. And each one of these is like a different vessel, okay, called kalim. The word vessels we translate as kalim. Now, the light that fills each of these vessels is the light of the one God. And therefore, the light is the same. Though there might be different vessels, there is no plurality in God whatsoever. God is one. But the light can come down into this world through these different vessels. And they are given different names. For instance, Chokhmah, Bina, Da'at, which means Chokhmah, Bina, Da'at, wisdom, insight, understanding. And then we go through and we have all the other 7 emotional attributes or sfirot. Okay? Chesed and Gevura, which means kindness and severity, Tiferet, which is beauty or the balance of the two, etc., etc. Now, each one of these gets a life force from the one God, and beneath that there is an archangel, right, which represents each of these different characteristics. So, for instance, Michael is the archangel of Chesed, of kindness. And then he gets his life force, so to speak, from that sphere or that vessel. And then following on from him are lower angels. And this keeps going down until it reaches each one of us. And until it reaches each different component of creation. So we're getting our life force through the system of filters. What happens every time that we do a sin, God forbid, an avera, so to speak? What do? We actually wound the angel that is bringing that life force or that blessing or that light down to us. And therefore the flow becomes obstructed. Makes sense. And not only that, but the wounded angel that's just, let's say, just above us, okay, that impact of it not being able to send the flow down also has an impact going upwards, because the angel above it will then feel that the flow is constricted, and the angel above it, etc., etc., until it reaches that keli, that vessel in which the divine light, called the Or Ein Sof, the light without end, which is God, more pure godliness, less filtered, okay, gets that message. And it's in that way that our merits, because this also works with good acts, there's an impact that goes up until it reaches that keli, and it reaches the or the light, okay? So it is through this system that the message is, so to speak, taken up to heaven, taken up to God, of both our merits as well as our transgressions. And we see from this that we actually are the ones who create a consequence for ourselves through every single thing that we do. And therefore, all our actions are consequential. We have the ability, that light is coming down to us all the time. We have to look at, what vessel am I, so that I can receive the light and the goodness that is already coming down to me all the time. And with that, we need to think about how each mitzvah actually opens up, each one opens up a channel of blessing. And that makes perfect sense, specifically if we look at it from the perspective of Hasidus and this whole system of the light coming down in a filtered way to us, and the messages or the impact we have going upwards. So we see from this that each mitzvah really is a way for connection, but it also is a way to open ourselves up to blessing, to more bracha. And therefore, it's our responsibility to say, what kind of vessel am I creating? And is there a block that I'm creating? And if so, let me look slowly, bit by bit, right? God is with us with a complete awareness at the same time. So it's not just like there's the system in place and it's happening without. Hashem is with us, and he takes care of us and supervises us and the minutiae of our lives at every moment as well. But bit by bit, we should look at how we can grow. And as long as we're on a path of continual growth, even if it means that, right, I'm going to now look at taking on a mitzvah that I can do in a realistic way, that I can come to love and will feel like I'm lacking when I'm not doing it. And in 6 months' time or another year, I will review and see what's the next mitzvah I can take on, right? Slowly, slowly, bit by bit. That's how we grow. That's how we grow in a sustainable way. And just to keep in mind, if we're going to bring the theme of darkness to pull it all together, is that when let's say you start doing a mitzvah, or you start to take a positive act, and at that point, everything goes wrong, don't feel disheartened. Understand the spiritual mechanics of this world are that we do have to get through the darkness in order to access the light. So it means that we're having a down, but that's part of the journey to the light. It's part of the journey to that ascent that we are longing for, or that we are aiming for, that is our goal. So once we understand the way that Hashem runs this world, then we can be more open to working with God. So many people get stuck in the darkness, and they don't understand that they're a few steps away from the light. If they'll just go forward positively, with trust, and as well as with holding on to the positive mitzvot that they're doing, or looking to see how they can increase in kedusha, in acts of holiness, they're getting to the light. If they get stuck in the darkness and say, at this point I give up, and I give up on God, He's so unfair on me, etc., etc., we're engaging with God from a point of ignorance. And that's why it's a mitzvah to learn Torah, because it empowers us to ultimately partner with Hashem and to allow ourselves to function at our optimum. Okay, so hopefully those are some insights that help us for this week's Parsha. If you'll bear with me, I have a beautiful story to tell that I actually heard earlier this week or last week from Rabbi Yossi Jacobson. And it's about the Rebbe, and it just shows how the Rebbe understood that every single Jew is really his personal responsibility, and how he was so practical, and yet he would think out of the box. And in the same way, we should keep in mind that every person within our frame of reference is also our responsibility in terms of what kindness can we show them? How can we lift them up? How can we take responsibility to assist them in some way? In the same way that Abraham, who was this paradigm of chesed, of kindness, was. So the Rebbe got a visit from one of his shluchim, from one of his emissaries, who was a rabbi in Brazil many years ago. And the rabbi asked him the following question. He said there were 2 Jewish schools in Brazil at that time, but they were struggling financially, and they did not have funds really to help these schools to function in a sustainable way. So they had decided, the 2 Jewish schools had decided, let's unite, let's amalgamate and pool resources, and this way we can function better, there won't be so much financial strain. And not only that, but this particular rabbi was very, very popular. And so they had asked him if, once the schools came together, if he would actually run them, if he would be the principal, if he would oversee everything. He was a very learned man, he had a lot of charisma, and everybody decided that they want him to be its leader. But before he could accept this position, he said, I'm a chassid of the Rebbe, and therefore I must consult with the Rebbe. And that's why he had gone to see the Rebbe to ask this question. And the Rebbe answered him as follows, and he said, it's not good that the 2 schools should amalgamate. It's better that they should continue to function and run separately. And so this chassid went back to Brazil, and he told them his answer, and he said, I'm terribly sorry, but I can't take up the position of running the 2 amalgamated schools. I have to do what my Rebbe said. And if you'll permit me, I'll continue running the 1 school, but if you want to fire me, the board of directors, and get someone else so you can amalgamate the schools, go ahead. So the community accepted his position, and they didn't, in fact, amalgamate the schools, but they actually felt quite resentful about it. It didn't make sense. They didn't understand, why doesn't the Rebbe want unity? Why doesn't he want us to pool our resources together? Like, what possible benefit could there be in having two separate schools? And the people were starting to feel like distaste towards the Rebbe's decision. They didn't understand it. So this rabbi decided he must go back to the Rebbe and get some answers so that he can represent the Rebbe to all these people and they can have a deeper understanding. And so he went back. And when he put his question to the Rebbe said to him, "Oh, you should have asked me straight away. Like, why didn't you ask me the first time that you came here when I gave you this answer?" And the Rebbe said as follows. He said, "The community in Brazil is not yet a strong community. There are only 2 Jewish schools." He said, "You know what? Parents are always going to find something to complain about. If they're going to complain about the food in the cafeteria, or they don't like the curriculum, or they don't like the way the school is run, or, you know, one school's policies is not against bullying enough. There'll always be reasons to complain against the school. And at some point, some parents might decide, I'm taking my child out of this school. If there are 2 Jewish schools, then they have the option of putting their child in the other Jewish school. But if there's only 1 Jewish school, then there's a good chance that many of these Jewish children will be lost to Judaism by being put in a secular school system." And the Rebbe said, and that is my reasoning behind keeping 2 schools open. And in fact, when the people heard this brilliance that they had never thought of from their own perspective, they embraced this decision and they continued with the 2 schools. The Rebbe felt that every child in these Jewish schools was his responsibility in terms of making sure that they grew up with a Jewish education. So if you're a teacher, if you are a child of parents or grandparents, if you're a parent, if you're a friend, we all have people within our frame of reference that we can do kindness to. And we need to see them as our responsibility to see what are their needs, how can we help, how can we uplift, and how can we try and inspire them in a gentle, loving way to stay on or to go more to the path of the Torah. Thanks, ladies. It was really special to see everybody today. Thank you so much. Thank you. So nice to see everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brigitte.
It's wonderful.
Thanks, Brigitte. Wonderful story.
Baruch Hashem. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Bridge?
Please ask. Yes, go for it.
Thank you. The angels, chas v'sholem, should we do an avera that are injured, do they heal eventually?
Yes, beautiful question. But what do you think the answer is, Raz? What's the healing?
I think Hashem would heal them, yes. Otherwise, there'd be a lot of injured angels.
Okay, teshuvah, right? Return.
Yes.
Acknowledging that which we may have done and then taking steps to go forward in a different way. And that's one of the greatest connectors between us and God, right? Hashem continually waits for our teshuvah. So yes, and that obviously will bring healing. So otherwise we'd all have a whole lot of broken angels, because who's perfect? There's no such thing.
I think there would be a lot of injured angels. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, sure.
Thank you, darling.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So nice to see everyone. Adele, Mel, Beulah, Sharon, everybody.
So,
God bless.
Brigitte, can I just ask you something? The 10 Sefirot that you spoke about, are those the same as the 10 utterances that they speak about with creation? Are those connected?
Good question, Mel. No, it's not. Okay, so God created the world through 10 utterances. And he gives expression to himself in this world through 10 Sefirot. So they're different. But if you
Okay.
look at that number 10, yeah, it's a great question.
Okay.
The number 10 is a number of order. It's a number, considered a number of kedusha, like holiness. As soon as you go out of that order, 11, you're in what's called klippa, which means like negativity or impurity. You're in the world of chaos.
Okay.
But interestingly, you'll find a lot of the holiest people associated with the number 11 because
Really?
because their holiness has the ability to heal or to transform that negativity and transform it to holiness. So, like if you look at the spices in the 11 herbs and spices, for instance, in the Ketoris, which was the incense offering, right? And
Yes.
that was the holiest offering. That was the holiest service in the temple. So why 11? Because it's so holy that it can transform to positive.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good to
Bye.
see you. Bye, everyone.